Hello! I'm coming at you from my basement because my husband is on a work call upstairs and our doors are thin and we can hear each other. So here I am downstairs. Um, so yesterday we talked classical conditioning. Today we are going to be talking about operant conditioning. We'll talk B.F. Skinner and kind of punishments and rewards, how those things shape behavior. You do have another formative check to complete today following the lecture. You do not have one for tomorrow. Tomorrow's is going to be a pretty short lecture, kind of low-key day if you need to kind of get caught up on some of the stuff. But with these two types of conditioning, really the only way to learn it and the only way to really understand it is to practice it. So just note that you have that to complete following the lecture today. Like I said, operant conditioning. Let's go. So like I said, today we are going to talk about operant conditioning. We're just going to start off by talking big picture, what is operant conditioning? Basically, it involves adjusting to the consequences of our behavior so that we can easily learn to do more of what works and less of what doesn't work. For example, as the ones that are listed on this slide, right, we may smile more at work after this repeatedly gets us bigger tips, or we learn how to use a bike using strategies that don't make us crash, right? This image down here at the bottom, basically, if I bounce a ball, I being the seal in this picture, if I bounce a ball, I get food. So I'm going to continue bouncing that ball. That behavior is then strengthened. When we're talking about the word strengthened in operant conditioning, we are saying that it's referring to making the behavior happen more frequently, right, with more intensity, or in the case of the seal, more accurately and reliably, right? I'm going to bounce this ball on my nose so that I can get food. We are going to talk about reinforcements and punishments. There are both positive and negative reinforcements and punishments. And so that's basically how operant conditioning works. You do something, you get a reward or a punishment, right? And so then you are either more or less likely to do that thing again in the future. We are going to break that down, obviously, in a lot more detail here, but I just wanted to give you kind of a heads up so that when we look at the two classical versus operant conditioning kind of juxtaposed next to each other, right? Classical conditioning is Pavlov and his puppies. You see, I even drew, or I didn't draw, but I added a cute little puppy here. So you never forget classical conditioning, Pavlov and his puppies. This is learning to link two stimuli in a way that helps us anticipate an event to which we have a reaction, right? The dog's making an association between the bell and the food makes them then salivate. On the flip side, operant conditioning is a change in behavior, choices in response to consequences, right? So we are going to do X, Y, or Z because it gets us what we want, and so then we're going to keep doing it so we can keep getting what we want. In this example here, right, the little boy says please, he gets a cookie, and so then he'll continue saying please because he got that reward the last time that he did it. Another kind of breakdown, obviously a more wordy comparison here. You have classical conditioning involving a respondent behavior, which is reflexive, automatic reactions such as fear or craving, right? Salivation, these biological, physiological, natural responses. That's what we're looking at when we're looking at classical conditioning. When we're looking at operant conditioning, we're looking at operant behavior. These are chosen behaviors which operate based on the environment. This is what we choose to do. Classical conditioning is what we naturally do and respond to, right? Looking here, right, there's a contrast between the process of conditioning. How do we actually train, quote unquote, train people, dogs, rats, whomever, to behave in certain ways? Well, in classical conditioning, you have the experimental stimulus,
repeatedly preceding the respondent behavior, and eventually it triggers that behavior. On the flip side, the experimental stimulus repeatedly follows the operant behavior and eventually punishes or reinforces that behavior. So again, we're going to break this down pretty significantly as we move forward, but it is important that you recognize the difference between classical and operant. Classical conditioning, Pavlov and his puppies, right? Operant conditioning, we're going to see a couple of other psychologists and what they did. Skinner's box, we'll look at pigeons, white rats, all that good stuff. So we're going to start looking at Thorndike's law of effect and basically what Thorndike did. Edward Thorndike was a psychologist, and he placed cats in a puzzle box, right? This like creepy looking cage thing right here, right? He would put them in there, and they had to complete a task, solve like a puzzle, and if they solved it, they got rewarded with food and were let out of the box. And basically what he noted was that the cats took less and less time to escape the box after repeated trials and rewards. So the more often they were rewarded for doing the task or the puzzle correctly, right, you can see the amount of time it took them decreased. So he came up with this law of effect, which states that behaviors followed by favorable consequences become more likely, and behaviors followed by unfavorable consequences become less likely. You'll notice that throughout this lecture, we're going to reference the idea of strength in terms of like the strength, a behavior being strengthened. We're using that, again, as I referenced before, in this idea that if it's strengthened, it's more likely to occur. And it's not only the likelihood, but the frequency of how often somebody's going to respond that way given a particular stimulus, or how consistently they're going to do it. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about strengthened. And so operant conditioning starts off with this understanding from Thorndike about the law of effect, right? Behaviors followed by favorable consequences, right? Those rewards, the cats are getting food and getting let out of the box, become more likely. So they're more likely and actually, in fact, quicker, right? Their behavior was strengthened. They were quicker at completing the puzzle to get out of the box. Then shifting and kind of adding to our understanding with Thorndike, and now we move on to B.F. Skinner. I referenced him in the classical conditioning lecture because he and John B. Watson were kind of the main guys that kind of, I don't want to say argued because they weren't really alive at the same time, but like their ideas came in conflict with one another because B.F. Skinner saw the potential for exploring and using Edward Thorndike's principles much more broadly, right? He asked questions like, how can we more carefully measure the effect of consequences on chosen behavior, right? So positive and negative consequences, punishments and rewards. What else can creatures be taught to do by controlling consequences, right? What happens when the change of timing, when we change the timing of reinforcement, right? If these cats didn't get their freedom immediately following solving the puzzle, right, would they associate freedom with solving the puzzle? Does that change things? And so we're going to look, obviously you see he's working with pigeons here. Skinner's worked with everything from pigeons to white rats to all sorts of different things, testing this idea of consequence and how it influences behavior. So Skinner's big kind of contribution, the first thing that he did and used as kind of a way to better understand operant conditioning was the B.F. Skinner operant chamber, or as most people call it today, the Skinner box. Essentially what Skinner did is he put these white rats in a box that had a light, a speaker, had some water, a bar, and a little food dispenser thing. And because this was such a controlled environment, right, it's a small box, there were very little other potential stimuli. It allowed detailed tracking of rates of behavior change in response to different rates of reinforcement. So how often we give food to the rats is going to influence how often they press the bar, right? So the bar or the lever, right, if you're looking right here, the bar that an animal presses randomly at first, later for rewards, right? So they don't know at first that the bar will give them food and water. And so what Skinner did is at first they would release the food just at random, but then they started releasing it immediately following any time the rat pressed the bar. The rat quickly learned, right, that pressing the bar got them a reward and therefore strengthened that behavior of pressing the bar, right? Strengthened, they wanted more food and therefore they'd press the bar more frequently. So with that, we're going to hop into our first real definition here, and that is reinforcement. Reinforcement refers to any feedback from the environment that makes a behavior more likely to recur. Now, we are going to look at reinforcements and we are going to look at punishments. Both of those things, reinforcements and punishments, have positive and negative versions of themselves. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but there are such things as positive and negative reinforcements, and there are such things as positive and negative punishments. It sounds kind of counterintuitive when we think about our own kind of schema of what a punishment or a reinforcement is. Reinforcement sounds good, punishment sounds bad, but that's not necessarily the case. So make sure that you are recognizing these psychology-specific definitions when we're looking at what operant conditioning is. So a reinforcement, any feedback from the environment that makes a behavior more likely to occur, right? More likely to occur. This could be positive by adding something desirable, or it could be negative by ending something unpleasant, right? In this particular example, the meerkat has just completed a task out in the cold, and for the meerkat, this warm light is desirable. Therefore, the positive reinforcement is the warmth, the light, right? You could also look at this as a negative reinforcement because we're removing the discomfort of being cold for this meerkat, right? Another example of a negative reinforcement would be you came home late, you came home past curfew, and so your parents take away your keys and don't allow you to drive for the next week, and that makes you more likely to come home on time. The negative reinforcement is removing your ability to drive, and the reason it's a reinforcement is that you're more likely to come home on time, right? That would be another example here of what a negative reinforcement might look like, right? Taking away, right? You're removing or ending something unpleasant. Whereas positive reinforcement, that one's pretty easy, right? Little kid wants a cookie, he says please, and he's given a cookie for saying please. So then with this understanding of reinforcement, how does this actually shape our behavior? So the example here is kind of a myth that was done or that's talked about in psychology. It's called shape the instructor. If students smile and nod more when the instructor moves left until the instructor stays pinned to the left wall, right? Every time they move left and the class smiles and nods, that behavior is reinforced, and therefore they continue to move left. And the myth has it that one class in a psychology class did this unbeknownst to their teacher until their professor actually went out the door and realized what was going on. Now, whether or not that actually happened, I don't know, but it is a good way to kind of illustrate how these reinforcements are actually helpful in shaping behavior, right? When a creature is not likely to randomly perform exactly the behavior you are trying to teach, you can reward any behavior that comes close to the desired behavior, right? A more realistic example of this would be the seal example that we referenced at the beginning of this lecture, right? Seals aren't naturally like going to balance a ball on their nose, right? That's not what they're born to do. They might nudge it up into the air, or they might like touch it with their nose, and maybe like they're not balancing it quite yet, but you can reward that. Okay, you touched it to your nose, like you get food, and then the next time, okay, you pushed it up into the air, you get food, and then you stop giving food for that behavior until they actually do in fact start to balance a ball on their nose, right? So it might not be a natural response, and it might take a couple of steps, but you can, in fact, use reinforcements to train certain behaviors and have them serve kind of as a command. These reinforcements serve as a command, do this and you get this. We also know that there are cycles of mutual reinforcement. I'm going to just look at this real quick, but I'm going to ask you, what is an example of a positive reinforcement or a negative reinforcement in this situation? Right? Children who have a temper tantrum when they are frustrated may get positively reinforced for this behavior. Parents who occasionally give in to those tantrums may also get negatively rewarded. So think about that. Pause this real quick. What would an example of a positive reinforcement be? What would be an example of a negative reinforcement in this situation? Okay, hopefully you took a second and you thought about that. Positive reinforcement, the kid gets what they want, right? In this picture, they're throwing a temper tantrum, and when they throw a temper tantrum, mom gives them a sandwich, they stop their temper tantrum. Are they more or less likely to have a temper tantrum to get what they want in the future? They're going to be more likely because they've been positively reinforced to do that again in the future, right? On the flip side, a negative reinforcement might come from the parent's perspective, right? The kid stops the tantrum. I gave them a sandwich and they stopped their tantrum. I'm more likely, right, to do that again because it removed the uncomfortable situation I'm in with my kid having a tantrum. I don't want my kid to throw a tantrum. I want that to stop. I'm uncomfortable. So if that stops, I'm more likely, right, again, a reinforcement, it strengthens behavior. I'm more likely to give in to a kid's temper tantrum because I want the removal of that negative feeling of my kid freaking out, right? Positive and negative reinforcements. Reinforcements always, always, always strengthen behavior. Again, reinforcements strengthen behavior. They make you more likely to do something. Positive, we're adding, I'm giving a sandwich, right? Negative, we're removing, the temper tantrum stops. Then it's important to recognize too that discrimination impacts our understanding of operant conditioning just as it did our understanding of classical conditioning, right? In this sense, discrimination refers to the ability to become more and more specific in what situations trigger a response, right? So maybe the child knows that temper tantrums don't work at home, but mom and dad get real embarrassed when they do it out in public, so they're quicker to get things that they want when they're in public throwing temper tantrums than when they're at home throwing temper tantrums, right? Shaping can increase discrimination if reinforcement only comes for certain discriminative stimuli, right? We were talking about the seals, right? Maybe they're not going to balance that ball on the top on their nose like right away, but if you provide them with a reinforcement when their nose touches the ball and they start to realize that, but then you stop giving them any sort of reward for that behavior, they're going to find a new behavior. Maybe it's every time they toss the ball in the air, they start to get reinforcements, right? They don't get it for just touching the ball anymore, right? They have to toss it in the air, right? That's going to be our discriminative stimuli. A couple examples for dogs, rats, and even spiders being trained to search for very specific smells, from drugs to explosives. Pigeons, seals, and manatees have been trained to respond to specific shapes, colors, and categories, right? You get a reward if you pick out the red block versus the green block, or if you pick out whatever. If you take AP Psych next year and we talk about language acquisition, we watch a couple of video clips of this like crazy parrot who's like can literally like do thinking, and it's crazy that he can pick out like the round thing out of like a whole bunch of shapes, or you can pick out the blue thing out of a bunch of different colors. Anyway, I digress. So I want you to pause it here, and I want you to think about why, in the context of operant conditioning, why do we go to work for money? Right? Why is this something that people engage in? Okay, so I want you to pause it, and in the case of operant conditioning, think about reinforcements, both positive and negative, right? Why do people work for money? So there's a lot of different, like, quote unquote, right answers to why do we work for money. Right, we could look at higher order conditioning. We could think about like classical conditioning. And if the pay is present along with other benefits, or during the process at a store when holding cash, we immediately predict getting something we already like, right? We want that ability to have money to buy things that we want. But also look at operant conditioning as we've been talking about it, right? Earning cash is reinforced with things money can buy. So there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle, and we can always look at behavior through like multiple different lenses. But here, we're going to look at the difference between a primary and a secondary reinforcer. Right? If we repeatedly introduce a neutral stimulus before a reinforcer, this stimulus requires the power to be used as a reinforcer. Right? A primary reinforcer is a stimulus that meets a basic need or otherwise is intrinsically desirable, such as food, sex, fun, attraction, attention, or power. I added attraction in there because that attention piece can, like, oftentimes is referencing like kids getting attention, but we also see adults doing similar, like, operant conditioning, operantly conditioned behaviors because they perceive attraction from like the opposite sex or something, right? So all of these are going to be like basic needs or intrinsically desirable things. A secondary or conditioned reinforcer is a stimulus such as a rectangular piece of paper with numbers on it, which has become associated with a primary reinforcer, right? Like, we're not working for the actual paper of that like is money. We're working for what money buys. So primary reinforcer is like the need to provide food for family, right? And the secondary or conditioned reinforcer is to get like actual cash. Like, I don't work for the email that says you've been direct deposited, right? Like, I work for what that direct deposit means for what I can do for my family and pay for our sod that we're getting next weekend and buying a new fence and all that good stuff, right? So we have primary and secondary reinforcers, but we also have delayed reinforcers, right? Humans, unlike any other creature, have the ability to link a consequence to a behavior even if they aren't linked sequentially in time, right? A piece of paper, the money, can be a delayed reinforcer paid a month later, and yet still it reinforces. We link it to performance. So I get paid by, twice, every 2 weeks. And that doesn't mean that, like, on the first Monday of my pay cycle, I'm not going to be like, oh, I'm not going to work very hard because I don't get paid until 2 weeks, right? Like, it doesn't work like that. We understand that it's going to be something that is compensated, and our performance and our ability to do our job, no matter when we get compensated, we will get compensated, right? If you give a dog a treat, so like another example would be like if you give a dog a treat 10 minutes after they did a trick, you're reinforcing whatever they did right before that treat, right? You're not reinforcing the trick because there's too much time between the trick and the treat giving. So dogs and most other animals respond to immediate reinforcement, but humans can do things like delaying gratification. They can like see a skill that's related to impulse control. They enable longer term goal setting. All of these things kind of show that delayed reinforcers that don't really work for other creatures do in fact work for people. So with that, we're going to shift to look at schedules of reinforcement. How often should we reinforce? Where we'll talk about continuous and intermittent reinforcement, and then watch a brief video of B.F. Skinner and his pigeons. But do note that your formative check today is going to ask you to not only be able to determine these different, if it's a positive or negative reinforcement or punishment or what have you, but also you're going to have to recognize different schedules of reinforcement. So the two big picture ones are continuous and intermittent. Continuous means that you give a reward after the target every single time. So every time in that Skinner box, every time the rat hit the bar, the rat would be rewarded. Right? The subject acquires the desired behavior very quickly. On the flip side, intermittent reinforcement means that you're giving the reward part of the time. Right? The target behavior takes longer to be acquired or established, but persists longer without reward. So for example, those rats in the Skinner box, if they're getting food every single time they hit the bar and then all of a sudden they stop getting food, they're pretty quick to stop hitting the bar, right? So with continuous reinforcement, they can acquire the behavior quicker, but it doesn't last as long. Whereas somebody with intermittent reinforcement, if a rat got the food every like 5 times he hit the bar, right, he would be more likely to continue hitting the bar following the fact that he didn't, in fact, get any food for a couple of hits or whatever. So like I said, you're going to watch this video about the pigeons, and then we'll talk real quick here.
Can pigeons read? This one gives every indication, because he's been taught to distinguish between 2 words and to behave appropriately. He's learned his different response to each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment. The first task was to isolate an individual piece of behavior and see how that could be changed. Skinner did this by keeping individual pigeons at about 3/4 of their normal weight, so that the birds were always hungry, and food could be used as an automatic reward. The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behavior, pecking a coloured disc, was measured on a graph. The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behavior of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered, or in Skinner's terms, what was the schedule of reinforcement.
The main thing is what we call schedules of reinforcement. Reinforcement is what the layman calls reward, and you can schedule it so that a reward occurs every now and then when a pigeon does something. We usually use a response with a pigeon pecking a little disc, a little spot on the wall, and you can reinforce with food. But you don't reinforce every time. Perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that. There are a very large number of schedules, and they have their special effects. And there is a good example of how you can move from the pigeon to the human case, because one of the schedules which is very effective with rats or pigeons is what we call the variable ratio schedule, and that is at the heart of all gambling devices, and has the same effect. The pigeon can become a pathological gambler just as a person can. Now, the fact that we found that out with pigeons and could prove it by removing and changing the schedule makes it easy for us to interpret the case with the human subject. We don't say that the human subject gambles to punish himself, as the Freudians might say, or gambles because he feels excited when he does so. Nothing of the sort. People gamble because of the schedule of the reinforcement that follows. And this is true of all gambling systems. They all have variable ratios built into them. So what we've learned from the pigeon, it made it possible to interpret this vast field very effectively.
Where does that leave free will? Because we all think we have a choice of whether to do things or not to do things.
Yes. Well, you see, it leaves it in the position of a fiction. We have assumed somehow or other that these internal states, feelings, and so on have initiated something. They have started something. They have created. We have done something in a voluntary way. We have willed to act. If you now look at the actual history, we find that there are external reasons why this has happened. In other words, by discovering the causes of behavior, we can dispose of the imagined internal cause. We dispose of free will as an American divine of the 18th century, Jonathan Edwards, did. He said, we believe in free will because we know about our behavior, but not about its causes. And of course, it's the object of a science of behavior to discover causes. And once you have found those causes, there is less you need to attribute to an internal act or will, and eventually, I think, we need to attribute nothing to it.
So there's some like visual example and also like real life Skinner talking to you. And so the question is, do we need to give a reward every single time, or is that even best? Skinner obviously experimented with the effects of giving reinforcement in different patterns, or what he called schedules, to determine what worked best to establish and maintain that target behavior. Again, not necessarily how quickly can you learn it, but how long will it last after we've removed the stimulus. And he found that if a pigeon, given a reward sometimes for pecking a key, later pecked 150,000 times without getting a reward. Trying to think like this pigeon, if the reward sometimes comes, even after not showing up for a while, maybe the 150,000th first time, or whatever, will be the time that he gets rewarded, right? Perhaps this is why neglected kids hold out hope for parental love and keep trying for it even after years without any response. If you think about this idea that on some rare occasion, there was apparently a loving moment that came from a parent of some sort, they're more likely to hold out because they're used to this idea of like not getting love, and then like a sporadic, gentle moment. They're more likely to hold out hope as opposed to a child who has been continuously given that love, and all of a sudden if it goes away, they don't really expect it to come back. So with that, there are, in fact, different schedules of partial or intermittent reinforcement. When we may schedule our reinforcements based on an interval of time that has gone by, this is going to either be a fixed interval schedule or a variable interval schedule, right? Fixed interval meaning we reward every hour. Variable meaning we reward after a changing or random amount of time passes. So like some calculated, we'll do every 3 minutes, then 5 minutes, then 7 minutes, then 3 minutes, then 5 minutes, then 7 minutes, or whatever that may be. So that's going to be based on an interval. So you have fixed interval and variable interval. And then you have this idea of planning for a certain ratio of rewards per number of instances of that desired behavior. So fixed ratio schedule, reward every 5 times the rat hits the bar, right? Or a variable ratio schedule is reward after a randomly chosen instance of the target behavior, right? Every 3, 5, and 7 times or whatever, right? So some examples of this. Fixed interval schedule could be something like you're paid once every week, right? It's a set time every week. Doesn't really matter how much you work, how many hours you work. If you're like an hourly worker, you might work 20 hours, you might work 4 on any given week, but you always get paid weekly, right? A variable interval schedule could be something like, let's see, maybe you're patted on the back occasionally. I don't know, like you get every time you do something well, or you, fun fact, I used to work at the store. I don't know if you've ever been to the store Posh Love at Ridgedale. I used to work there in college. So maybe I'm organizing the necklaces on a necklace hanger and I get patted on the back. And my good work is rewarded every once in a while. So I continue doing good work with the hopes of being recognized for it. Right? A fixed ratio schedule would be that like maybe you're paid every 40 hours of work that you complete, right? It doesn't matter how long those 40 hours take you, how many days. Maybe you work overtime and you do 40 hours of work in 4 days, then you get paid for those 40 hours. And every time you do 40 hours, you're getting paid. So this isn't based on time, right? This is based on how often you're doing the behavior, right? And then the last one, variable ratio schedule. Maybe unpredictably you get a good job, quote unquote good job, comment about some unit of work that you completed, like, great job, Sarah, you organized the necklaces, or you folded those jeans and organized them so well, or you changed the mannequins in the front to really look fashionable and stylish so that people want to come shop at our store. Oh man, those are the glory days. But maybe that variable ratio schedule is something that's influencing you and getting you to continue to work hard. A visual way to kind of look at that would be this flow chart, right? What is the reinforcement based on? Is it based on how often they do the behavior or the time? That's going to bring you to ratio or interval. Do we know exactly when it will be reinforced? Yes, it's fixed. No, it is variable. Okay, so just kind of reference this if you are trying to remember the differences between the different types of reinforcement schedules. So with that, then I have you guys pause this video and actually practice. Are these ratio or interval? Are they fixed or variable? This is your practice for this. We don't have these specific types of questions in the formative check. The formative check is solely focused on reinforcements and punishments. So this is your practice. You will need to know this. So pause it, go through in your notes and write which you think this is. Is it ratio, a fixed ratio? Is it fixed interval, variable ratio, or variable interval? Again, you're more than welcome to reference back to that flow chart. Might be worth writing that down in your notes and going through this, and then we'll go over the answers here in just a second. So pause it, do your best, and we'll talk about them. Okay, so here are the answers. Rat gets food every third time it presses the lever. That is an example of a fixed ratio schedule. Number 2, getting paid weekly no matter how much work is done. That's going to be a fixed interval. Number 3, getting paid for every 10 boxes you make is going to be fixed ratio. 4, hitting a jackpot sometimes on the slot machine is a variable ratio. Number 5, winning sometimes on the lottery you play once a day could be variable interval or variable ratio. The reason being, if you play once a day, then the ratio or the percentage of behaviors rewarded and the interval or the percentage of days are rewarded are the same. So both answers are ultimately correct here. Number 6, checking your cell phone all day and only sometimes getting a text. That's a variable interval. The reward here for checking messages is a function of time, right? Not a function of how often you check. So if you think about that, you check your cell phone continuously throughout the day, and sometimes you get a text. At any given time, you're going to get a text. It's not based on how many times you check your phone. So that's going to be an example of variable interval. Number 7, you buy 8 pizzas, get the next one free, right? That's a fixed ratio. Number 8, fundraiser averages 1 donation for every 8 houses visited. That's a variable ratio. When we're talking about the word average here, it's crucial in our understanding of what's going on here, right? Donations can vary tremendously, so the average is no guaranteed of a fixed ratio of donations every 8th house, right? It's the average, right? So all of them compiled, there's no guarantee for that fixed ratio every 8 houses, if that makes sense. Number 9, kid has tantrum, parents sometimes give in. That's variable ratio. And then number 10, repeatedly checking mail until paycheck arrives. This is fixed interval. So this is different from the checking your phone all day because the idea here is that paychecks come regularly. They come on a fixed interval, while text messages, like in number 6, right, are coming at variable intervals. So just recognize that. Those are your examples. If you have questions, again, just shoot me an email and we can talk through them, because you will have to know these moving forward. So the question remains, which reinforcements produce more of the responding behavior, right? More of the target behavior. We know that fixed interval schedules are slow and unsustained in terms of how often they're going to respond, right? Or they're going to respond. If I'm only paid for my Saturday work, I'm not going to work as hard on the other days, right? That makes sense. Variable interval is slow and consistently responding. If I never know which day my lucky lottery number will play off, I better play it every day. Or if, say, like if in school, right, like I might say, you have to take 5 quizzes today. I'm only going to grade 3, but you don't know which 3. You're going to work hard on all of them for fear that I might pick the 2 that you didn't work very hard on, right? So you can see kind of in this graph here, fixed interval is slow and unsustained. The responding time near reinforcement is quick, but then it's inconsistent, right? Whereas variable interval is far more steady response there. Looking at this one, fixed ratio has a high rate of responsiveness, and variable ratio is highly consistent. So, right, if we're talking fixed ratio, buy 2 drinks, get 1 free, I'm going to buy a lot of drinks. Actually, right now at my grocery store, 12 packs of Diet Coke are buy 3, get 2 free, and it's like a killer deal. And I'm like, I might go buy 6 and get 4 free, because why not? But that's the idea of fixed ratio, right? There's a high rate of response. Whereas variable ratio has highly consistent responses, even if the reinforcement stops, right? Let's say a slot machine sometimes pays. I'll keep pulling the lever as many times as possible because it may pay out just this next time, right? So we continue pulling the slot machine handle time and time and time and time again, because there's the potential that it might pay out next time. So then we're going to flip. We've been talking about reinforcements this whole time, but there are also going to be punishments that we are going to need to recognize. Punishments have the opposite effect of reinforcement. In fact, these consequences make the target behavior less likely to occur in the future. There are positive and negative punishments, right? A positive punishment, you add something unpleasant or aversive. This is kind of your like a physical abuse, like you're adding something unpleasant. You're making your child wash their mouth out with soap if they swear, right? To lessen the amount of times they swear. A negative punishment then is you take away something pleasant or desired. Negative is kind of like it's like a double negative here, a negative punishment, right? You take away something desired or pleasant, minus is the negative here. So this is kind of counterintuitive. So go back to the example that I said about like you come home after curfew and so your parents take away your car keys and they say you can't drive anymore. We're taking away your ability to drive to lessen the chance that you are going to, in fact, come home late. I want you to come home late less, so I'm going to say you can't drive until you start coming home on time, mister, right? So that would be another example of a negative punishment, right? Positive does not mean good or desirable, and negative does not mean bad or undesirable. Again, this is not intuitive. Positive means you are adding something uncomfortable. Negative means you're removing something pleasant. You're just going to have to remember this. I can only do so much to say it time and time again. You're going to practice it. You're going to get some feedback. But ultimately, you are just going to have to take some time and memorize these ideas. So the question then is, when is punishment effective? Punishment is really only effective when it approximates the way we naturally encounter immediate consequences. And so to give further insight into that, in natural settings, when we encounter punishing consequences from actions, right? So for example, reaching into a fire, in that case, operant conditioning helps us avoid dangers, right? A natural consequence is you get burned when you stick your hand into a fire. So that's a positive punishment. You're adding something uncomfortable, a burn, and it's going to limit you. It's going to make you less likely to put your hand in the fire in the future. It's also effective when we try to artificially create punishing consequences for others' choices. Ultimately, these work best when the consequences happen as they do in nature. So again, that kind of natural piece, and this goes to be with going to jail or getting fined, or kind of the legal punishments that you might encounter in regards to breaking the law or whatever. If you break the law, if you steal something, you have to pay for it in full, or you have to work volunteer hours or do some sort of community service or whatever. These are natural consequences for our actions. And have these been learned? Yes, they're artificially imposed, but they're a pretty standard understanding across society today, right? Severity of punishments is not as helpful as making the punishments immediate and certain. So when there's people that debate the death penalty, whether it works or not, actually research has been done to show that more effective ways to use punishment to shape behavior is to make sure that it is immediately following whatever the behavior is, and it is certain, and it's every single time it happens, right? If a little kid throws a temper tantrum, they have to go sit in timeout immediately following their temper tantrum, and it's every single time. This is going to work better than getting really aggressive and yelling at said baby child for having a tantrum, right? Everybody parents differently. These are just examples, and whether or not your family or people have employed these methods or not, or how you do that, don't come at me. These are just some examples of studies and applications of operant conditioning. With that, then, there is problems with physical punishment. Generally speaking, punished behaviors may restart when the punishment is over, right? Learning isn't necessarily lasting. If a kid gets spanked for doing a behavior, once that spanking's over and the pain is gone, they kind of quickly forget the negative consequence for engaging in that behavior, right? In that scenario, instead of learning behaviors, the child may learn to discriminate among situations and avoid those which punishment might occur, right? Again, a tantrum at home may get them spanked. A tantrum out in public, maybe mom and dad don't want to show that they spank their child in public, might not. So maybe your child is more likely to have a temper tantrum in public because they know that you won't react with some sort of physical punishment. Instead of behaviors, the child might learn an attitude or of fear and hatred, which could interfere with learning. This can generalize to a fear or hatred of all adults in many settings. So just recognizing that physical punishment, based on the research done, generally is pretty ineffective long-term for changing behavior, as well as it can be pretty detrimental to a child's social development. So then we're going to shift here and kind of do an example. I don't want you to think about the beach. Don't think about the beach. Don't think about the waves, the sand, the towels, the smell of sunscreen, the sailboats, surfboards, the waves, right? The palm trees. Don't think about the beach. Are you obeying my instruction? Are you not thinking about the beach? Because I sure am. And the question then, the next question that this slide begs is, would you obey this instruction more if you were punished for thinking about the beach? Probably not. The problem with this is that punishing focuses on what not to do, which does not guide people to a desired behavior, right? Even if undesirable behaviors do stop, there's no like direction or guidance into what to replace that behavior with. Right? So the lesson here, in order to teach desired behavior, we reinforce what's right more often than punishing what's wrong. And that goes to show the power of rephrasing, right? Instead of getting mad at a child, right, you could give a positive punishment. You're playing video games instead of practicing the piano, so I'm justified in yelling at you. I'm adding something uncomfortable to make you stop playing video games, right? A negative punishment, you're avoiding practicing, so I'm turning off your game, right? I'm getting rid of something you enjoy, playing video games, to lessen you from playing video games and instead have you play the piano, right? Negative reinforcement, I will stop staring at you and bugging you as soon as I see that you are practicing, right? I want you to practice the piano, and so I'm going to look at you and make you feel weird and uncomfortable until you choose to play the piano. Then I'll remove that uncomfortableness, right? And then the last one here, positive reinforcement. After you practice, we'll play a game. Right? We'll add something fun and desirable if you practice, right? So when we're talking about a parent wanting to stop their kid from playing video games and instead play the piano, you can literally look at that scenario from all four of these different ways. You can look for a positive punishment, a negative reinforcement, or a positive reinforcement, just depending on how you phrase it and what you're actually looking at. So when you're going through and you're giving these examples, and in the FRQ, if you're asked to determine these, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, just make sure you're being very clear in what is a positive punishment and how is this an example of it, or whatever. Here are your kind of types of consequences. I'm going to let you look at this. I've said these examples like 8,000 times. So if you want, feel free to pause this and jot down this quick chart so that you have a reminder. And another just kind of visual. The goal is, do we want the behavior to be encouraged or punished? And then is it positive or negative, right? Again, another visual kind of flow chart to give you a better understanding of these different types of operant conditioning. Okay, so just for the sake of your time, I'm going to kind of cruise through these last couple of slides. They're just kind of overviews. So I feel like if you would like to jot down these notes, you can just pause and jot down the notes as we go through. But B.F. Skinner's view basically says that the way to modify behavior is through consequences, right? This is different from Pavlov and his puppies, classical conditioning, John B. Watson, little Albert, right? This is different from that because they're not necessarily like physiological, biological responses that are classically conditioned. Instead, B.F. Skinner would say we're modifying behavior through certain consequences. He also would say that behavior is influenced only by external feedback, not by thoughts. And this kind of goes on. Critiques of Skinner would say that this particular type of conditioning leaves out the value of instruction and modeling. So this is basically saying, like, you don't need to go to school. Like, kindergarten doesn't really teach you how to behave. Instead, like, we should just give you punishments and rewards to shape your behavior, right? That's kind of an impractical understanding. And we also know that adult humans have the ability to use thinking and make choices and plans above and beyond. Yeah, I know I'll get a cookie if I say please, but do I really want a cookie? Like, I can think. So just kind of recognize his view, these critiques. These are some examples of operant conditioning. So feel free to just read through these real quick, get some examples if you need further insight. Here we have our contrasting types of conditioning. So we have the basic idea, response, acquisition, extinction, all of these kind of terms that we talked a lot about yesterday, and how they apply to both classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So I want you to read through these. Again, for the sake of your time, I don't need to go, and we've talked about both of these things as they exist in classical and operant conditioning. This is just a chart bringing them together and comparing and contrasting. So if you have questions as you're jotting these down, feel free to reach out. I'm going to continue moving on. We have just a couple more slides. Actually, one more slide and then a fun video. Here again is that comparison between operant and classical conditioning. So if you have questions distinguishing between the two, I've said this like 1,000 times in the last minute, but reach out. I'll answer any questions. With that, quick fun video from Big Bang Theory. Fun fact, my husband and I and my brother-in-law, Neil's brother Charlie, just started watching The Big Bang Theory all the way from the beginning because we finished that 70s show. We watched the entire series of that 70s show, which is good. It was funny. Over the past 4 or 5 months, we've been kind of watching that, so now we're shifting over to Big Bang Theory, and I thought this was really funny. So enjoy. This kind of brings it all together. Operant conditioning, punishments and rewards, how we shape behavior.
Are you finished?
Well, thank you. How thoughtful. Would you like a chocolate?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Sheldon. I almost sat in your spot.
Did you? I didn't notice. Have a chocolate.
Thank you.
You're here a lot now.
Oh, am I talking too much? I'm sorry. Zip.
Thank you. Chocolate?
Yes, please. Oh, hey, Kim. Yeah, you know what? Hold on. Let me take this in the hall. You'll never guess who they got to replace you with one.
Okay. I know what you're doing.
Really?
Yes. You're using chocolates as positive reinforcement for what you consider correct behavior.
Very good. Chocolate?
No, I don't want... Sheldon, you can't train my girlfriend like a lab rat.
Actually, it turns out I can.
Well, you shouldn't.
There's just no pleasing you, is there, Leonard? You weren't happy with my previous approach to dealing with her, so I decided to employ operant conditioning techniques, building on the works of Thorndike and B.F. Skinner. Yet by this time next week, I believe I can have her jumping out of a pool, balancing a beach ball on her nose.
No, this has to stop now.
I'm not suggesting we really make her jump out of a pool. I thought the bazinga was implied. We're just tweaking her personality, just sanding off the rough edges, if you will.
No, you're not sanding Penny.
Are you saying that I am forbidden from applying a harmless, scientifically valid protocol that will make our lives better?
Yes, you're forbidden.
Bad, Leonard. You know, using positive reinforcement techniques, I could train that behavior out of her in a week.
No.
If you let me use negative reinforcement, I can get it done before we go to bed.
You're not squirting her in the face with water.
No, of course not. We're talking very mild electric shocks. No tissue damage whatsoever.
Forget it.
Oh, come on. You can't tell me that you're not intrigued about the possibility of building a better girlfriend.
I'm not. Penny's qualities, both good and bad, are what make her who she is.
You mean like that high-pitched, irritating laugh?
Yes.
You wouldn't prefer a throaty chuckle?
You're not changing how Penny laughs.
No, that would be incongruous. I was going to lower the whole voice to a more pleasing register.
Sorry, guys. That girl is freaky.
Come again?
Freaky.
Freaky?
Yeah, freaky.
Have a chocolate.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to make some warm milk and then turn in. I trust if you two are planning on engaging in amorous activities, you'll keep the decibel level to a minimum.
Of course.
Thank you.
Unbelievable.
Big Bang Theory is funny. I'm excited to get further into it. We're only like 4 episodes into the first season. But anyway, I digress. There you have it. Operant conditioning. As I've said like 8,000 times over the last 2 lectures, if you have questions, please reach out. You will need to be able to recognize the difference between classical and operant conditioning. You will need to be able to define the different types of punishments or reinforcements. You will need to recognize conditioned and unconditioned stimulus for the FRQ. So practice, practice, practice. If you have questions or need clarification, please don't hesitate to reach out and we'll work through it together. I think, well, second to last Thursday for you guys. Next Thursday is going to be the last day of school. It doesn't even feel like the end of school because we're all at home. At least it's been nice out. All right. Later, Gators.